everyone, and welcome to Pod TV's Economic Show with the Honorable David M. Walker, who is the former Comptroller General of the United States, and of course, our esteemed global panel of subject matter experts discussing all of the current economic affairs that are occurring right now, not just in the United States, but in the whole world, and how it's impacting us and the rest of the world. So today, everyone, please join me in welcoming some of our panelists. David will be joining us later, as we all know. He's been to Washington on Capitol Hill, pitching some solutions that we need. But with us today, we have Peter Bennett from Wall Street Hackers. Hello, Peter. How are you doing?
Hey, Kim. Good to see you.
Welcome. We have Mr. Dan Worthington. Oh, all right.
Dan?
Step away a minute. And we have Lee Newton. Hi, Lee
Good
from
morning.
Rhode Island. He's one of our panelists on our World Edition and a couple of other shows. And we always welcome your thoughts. Are you running for president?
That's what it says. Technically, yes. I did register.
Okay, I love it. I mean, we're going to have to talk about that someday.
Well, if you win, please make me your presidential advisor, because that's my dream, to be like a top presidential advisor.
My number one thing is to include people from Pod TV.
There you go.
You not only have a support, but you've got people willing to work with you. How beautiful.
We have a deeper bench on Pod TV than we do in Washington. I really believe that.
Yeah, I agree. Did any of you get to watch some of what David did last Monday?
Oh, yeah, I did. Yeah, I watched a lot of it. It was very interesting. It was really, I mean, it's an incredible problem, the debt problem. And I don't know if it was David or I think somebody else said it, but, you know, that there's so much talking about it. You know, they've been talking about it for decades, but it's a real crisis. It's one of many crises the country faces, but this is one that won't be avoidable. I mean, we should be adjusting to it to get you ready for it and just handle it the best we can. But this is coming. They're going to be putting
Peter, you just made a comment. Peter, you just made a comment. They've been talking for decades.
Hi, Dan.
Congress talks for decades about a lot of things, immigration, debt, what have you. Do they ever solve anything, or do they just the appearance of that they're busy?
Well, since you asked me, well, sometimes things get solved and sometimes they don't. And, you know, I mean, look, there are sensitive political issues, first of all, that like Medicare and Social Security, huge unfunded gaps, maybe more money than all in the stock that exists in the stock market, bond market. And by the way, this is in every country of the world. I always have to throw that in because, you know, I've looked at China, I've looked at India, I've looked at European countries, I've looked at South America. Countries, they're all in huge deficits on their pension plans, but even those might be manageable. But it's the free medical care for everybody over 65 in the United States for a lot of it, plus the free medical care totally in a lot of other countries on aging demographics where the money's already spent. So this is going to create.
Peter, that wasn't always the case, though. Am I wrong? When we started out as a country, we didn't have this debt. We didn't have these entitlements.
I want to welcome Sasha, but real quick. Also, Lee, you know, you make a good point there, and we'll get back. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to welcome Sasha as well. But you're right. Nobody ever starts out, I don't think, with debt. We all, you know, maybe start out with knowing that there's a budget, but what we never had ever was a budget. Would y'all mind just taking a real quick minute to watch just the first video clip of him there at Capitol Hill, just the first little bit, just so that we can kind of hear what he said? Would you? I've got it already staged where he starts speaking, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Go for
All
it.
right. So let's pull this up. Oops. Present screen. I had it staged. There we go. All right. So can you see this is the judiciary hearing, and let's play.
We will begin with you, and I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Boyle, members of the House Budget Committee. Appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm a political independent who has been fighting for fiscal responsibility and sustainability for 30 years, beginning when I was one of 2 public trustees for Social Security and Medicare, and we blew the whistle to say that those programs were not sustainable in their present form. When I became Comptroller General of the United States and head of the GAO in 1998, that GDP was about 60%, and we were in surplus. When I left as head of the GAO in 2008, debt to GDP was a little over 60% before the banking crisis, but I could tell that we were in terrible shape and things were going to get a lot worse. Unfortunately, since I left GAO, the debt subject to the debt ceiling has tripled, debt to GDP has doubled, and both metrics are still increasing at a rapid rate. The latest CBO budget and fiscal report in February 2023 included the following direct quote: "The fiscal outlook is far worse than last year due to legislation, executive actions, and economic changes. The latest consolidated and accrual-based financial statements and GAO audit report for the fiscal year ended 2022 made it clear that 2022 was a very bad year. Total liabilities and unfunded promises went up by almost $9 trillion to over $900,000 per household. In addition, we look at during the past 2 years, the Congress, 2+ years, the Congress is engaged in trillions of dollars of additional federal spending, much of which related to COVID, some of which because of belief in the flawed and failed modern monetary theory. The Fed, intentionally or unintentionally, enabled such actions by keeping interest rates too low for too long and bought trillions of dollars of Treasury securities directly. The resulting significant increase in interest rates resulting from the Fed's effort to combat inflation during the past year contributed to the recent bank failures and current uncertainty in our banking system. Looking forward, the latest CBO long-range budget projection of February 2023 estimated the debt to GDP will climb to 193% by 2050. That's an 8% increase above the projection last year. You know, there's a tendency to focus on numbers when talking about budget proposals, but it's important to remember that the budget is not just about numbers. It's a proposed policy path. From a strategic standpoint, the plain and simple and hard truth is the United States is a declining great power and China is rising. The facts are clear and compelling. It is true that the U.S. is the leading global today, but the question is, will we remain so in the future? One of the biggest differences between China and the U.S. is that China has a comprehensive, integrated, outcome-based strategic plan to achieve its economic, diplomatic, military, and cultural objectives, and the United States does not. The federal budget is a short-term policy proposal. It's not a long-term plan, and it's not outcome-oriented. Today, America is flying blind in mountains of debt and without a navigation system. This is unacceptable and must change if we want our future to be better than our past. President Biden proposed his fiscal 2024 budget on March 9. It proposes a 57% increase from the pre-pandemic level in fiscal 2019 and results in annual deficits in excess of 5% of GDP over the next 10 years, despite $3 trillion in tax increases during the same period. While it does propose some Medicare funding-related reforms that will extend the solvency life of the HI Trust Fund, it does not deal with the other Medicare programs and does not touch Social Security. As a result, it continues to kick the can down the road in making the tough choices that are necessary to restore sanity. I've suggested a 3-pronged approach to be able to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability outlined in my testimony. First, stop the bleeding. We need to cut 2024 spending as compared to 2023. I outlined a number of ideas how to do that. Secondly, we must stabilize the patient. We have to have a mechanism that will help us to make the tough choices to close the gap between projected spending and projected revenue over the next 10 to 15 years. That will require educating and engaging the American people in a very meaningful way. I outline the reasons why in my testimony, and I suggest that we need a statutory fiscal sustainability commission that will engage the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, come back with recommendations, guaranteed vote in Congress. That's what we need to do. Simpson-Bowles was not focused that way. That should be an appropriate condition to raising the debt ceiling. We have to cure the disease. In that regard, Statutory approaches have failed. The debt ceiling is a bad joke. We need a constitutional amendment that limits debt as a percentage of the economy, and I commend Chairman Arrington for introducing HCR 24, and I would ask all of you to look at HCR 24 and potentially co-sponsor it. You have a constitutional duty under Article 5, and this Convention of States to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment should have been called in 1979, and I outline all the differences. And the dollar has gone down over 75% since then, and the debt has exploded from less than $1 trillion to $32 trillion. In closing, we need to learn from history, and we need to learn from others. I'll give you one piece of history.
Thanks.
Rome lasted over 1,000 years. It was a superpower in its time. Rome no longer exists. It went out for several reasons: fiscal responsibility, political incivility, moral decline, overextended military, and inability to control its borders. Do those sound familiar? It's time to wake up, create mechanisms to make tough choices so that our future can be better than our past. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Hey guys, what do you think?
Here. Can we see that again, Ken? That was good.
It was good. It was really good.
Good job.
I think he's been saying these things continuously on our show, because sometimes we have to repeat things over and over, not just because we don't believe people hear us. It's because we need to establish credibility of what these items are. I think he nailed it. And, in 5 minutes, I don't know why it's so hard for our government to unite together and make these solutions. But there was something stated in there that just concerned me. And it sounded like that some of our officials did a lot of this intentionally for their own personal gains. And did I hear that correct?
They've been doing that for years.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Wait, I want to throw in, you're saying, why are they doing it? And I don't think it's necessarily corruption. It's the system. It's easier as a politician to, one, promise the world or promise a lot more, because it appeals to your voters. Two, it's especially on these tough issues like Medicare and Social Security and a lot of other issues too, but especially these, it's a third rail. So if especially, unfortunately, the Democrat Party, if the Republicans bring it up, they say,
Peter, isn't that the definition of corruption?
You want to throw grandmother under the bus? Well, I'm not saying look, I don't know if it's intent. I'm sure there's corrupt politicians. I know.
These people aren't stupid, Peter. They know what they're doing.
Well, what would you do if you were a politician and you knew that if you brought up Medicare, you'd be thrown out of office?
Well, why are you there? You're there to do the job. If it makes you not electable, then that's the system. Fine, but you're not there to call it what you want. And that to me is the definition of corruption.
No,
that's not your job. Your job is not to get elected.
Lee, you're right. Totally. It should be that way. But the other side is, let's say you have two parties and they're very evenly split. If you had one party in control, maybe it would be better than two parties. But let's say there's a battle between Democrats and Republicans and it's almost 50-50 like in the Senate. Well, if the Democrats or the Republicans, especially the Republicans, start pushing Medicare reform, maybe that just gives the Democrats power, and they're the ones who seem less likely in a way to look at certain solutions, although they have other solutions. So,
Peter, you can say that I'm naive how the system works, but I think the way the system is supposed to work is it should be irrelevant who's there, Republicans and Democrats. You're there to follow the Constitution.
I agree totally. It should be that way. I think 2 points. One, which I just thought of, would be term limits. Term limits would help a lot, because then you'd be like, okay, personally, I'd make it maybe 6 years in the House, 6 years in the Senate, or whatever, just one term, president 2, 6 years, maybe alternating. And then everybody wouldn't worry about the next election. Do the right thing. Don't worry about the next election. So that would maybe go towards solving the problems in a system where people can be in office for 20 or 30 years and they can self-justify. Well, I'm not doing the right thing now, but I'll do it later, but I don't want to lose power because then I can't do anything.
And then you have the lobbyists and the K Street influencers,
Sure.
and you have the deep state, the civil servants who can really pretty much control everything anyway. And its system is corrupt. That's
Wouldn't term limits help solve that problem too? Because now those lobbyists can say, "Oh, we're going to donate to your campaign," and they would say, "What campaign? I'm finished."
Yeah, well, it might, but it also, the problem is
it would help.
We need to find a way to weaken what's called the bronze triangle, because they have a tremendously disproportionate influence on the government. Just see what happened to Trump, right? He took on the deep state, and he got
Dan and Lee. Quick question for everybody.
Yeah, I got a question for Dan, but go on, Mark.
No, I had a quick question for everybody. Everybody here has probably at one point or another, because I know a lot of y'all's history works for a company and or whether it was a nonprofit or a profit company. And every company that I am aware of, at some point or another, you have your job reviewed. Am I not right, Kim? And who is doing the review on the congressman? I have yet to hear of a congressman having his job reviewed and things along those lines.
The voters, Mark.
Well, that's supposed to be the voters, but I'm just saying that there should be a system where they also have their what they are doing reviewed on a regular basis.
Who sets the matrix for that, Mark? And how do you keep that from being over political? See, here's the problem. Right? You got people like Biden in power right now that wants to have his climate agenda and everything else, and wants everybody to invest their pensions in everything he supports, and is directing that happens by fiat, right? And has all these social programs, these executive order exists and executive order that, and that's not his job as the executive. That's Congress's job. The problem is Congress won't do jack or won't do what the president wants. So the president does whatever he wants. And then you got K Street and the money and the prostitution and the bribes and the favors and promises for jobs when they get out and all the other things that are going on that create tremendous pressure and corruption with respect to these Congress people and these in the executives. I mean, Biden's been there a long time, like 50 years. And he knows how all the games are played. He knows where all the bodies are buried. And, that's one of the reasons why they wanted him there, despite his inability to really function.
Well, Dan,
skeletons in closet, right? The skeletons in the closet.
Well, there's a lot of skeletons.
He knows where they are.
Dan, wouldn't term limits? Let me throw something else out. I don't know if anybody's ever heard this. Somebody must have said it, but here's my idea for how to get term limits in effect. And I've never read this or heard it, but this is one of my ideas. So my idea is don't put term limits in today, because nobody's going to vote for term limits on themselves in the next 4 years. Rather say, we're going to kick term limits in 10 years. Now, we're going to revise the system, but 10 years down the road. So, you're guaranteed a work job for 10 years. Then you get elected, maybe you get another 6 years or another term, and then you're finished. Now, for the rest of time, we have a system where there are term limits. And again, you lower the power of money. Not that you've eliminated it, but you've lowered a lot of the power of money. And you've also given more incentives to do the right thing, as Lee said.
I agree kind of with that, because nobody's going to vote on a bill to outsource their own jobs. Exactly. And so that's a very smart idea. But also, why not change the incentive programs a little bit and do them like you probably do, like advisors or anyone else. If the economy is doing good, then you get an increase in pay. If it's doing bad, you get percentage decrease, just like you would probably in a job, a sales job, right? Your commission, you're paid more on a commission basis, but if you're not doing your job, then you get a decrease in your salary. But all they ever do, the most important election that they do every year, the most important thing that they all show up for every year is voting on their own pay scales. It literally, nobody ever misses that day. So I would say I like David's idea. I mean, I don't know if I heard this wrong, but appointing an accountability administration to review some of the things that are going on. But I say, as a whole, they need to be paid according to the way things are going. So if things are not going, then they all get a pay cut, period. If things are going good and they build it back up, they get a pay raise.
But how would you administer that? Because that comes down to something that Dan was just talking about. There's reports going out right now that apparently on the first quarter, the economy was supposed to be on an uptick. So, but there are a number of folks that I know that are still struggling, still not having this supposed uptick that is going on. So if we are in the middle of an economic increase, then that would mean that those people would get a raise, according to what you're saying, Kim. When those
you pay them on the job done, Mark. Not so much that it's getting better, that it has become better.
Kim, the problem with that is it's not like in business. Look, if you're in business, there's a very select number of criteria you can look at to judge a CEO, right? You can say, I'm going to look at your revenue growth. I'm going to look at profitability. You can put on a handful, maybe what your criteria are. But, if you're talking about, politics, you're talking about thousands of issues. One, some areas could be getting better. Some areas could be getting worse. Two, you're talking about a lot of things that they have very little control over. Look, as an example, when a president comes in for several years, the policies of the last president are the ones that affect them. So,
Peter, isn't that the president's problem, though? Why is he not doing turnover when a CEO comes into a corporation? He brings his people in with him, and he lays off and fires all the other ones.
I'm saying there are lags in the.
Well, why not, though? Why are you saying that?
Some of those jobs are, my understanding, some of those jobs are career jobs. So, I mean, unless you're going to change the nature of the system, there are some jobs that are literally you come in and they are brand new, like all the secretary jobs, Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce, all of those are brand new. But there are a lot of people that are in those jobs until they decide to quit and everything. So there's a lot of federal jobs that are very much not at necessarily the disposal of the president.
They're retired.
Does that make sense?
But let's welcome David, and maybe he can enlighten us some on the conversation that we're having, because he just seems to have the knowledge of why some of these things can and cannot exist. And so join me in welcoming David back from Capitol Hill. Welcome.
Welcome. Good to see you. Well, what I heard you talking about, and I had three things that I was going to put on the table for us to potentially talk about. I've been a presidential appointee with unanimous Senate confirmation 3 times for the Reagan administration, for the Bush 41 administration, and then during the Clinton and Bush 43 administrations. The president can nominate presidential appointees, but the most important jobs are presidential appointee with Senate confirmation. And that takes time. It takes time for the Senate to be able to confirm. A vast majority of the people who work for the federal government are not political appointees. They're career civil service that are there for decades in many cases. All right. They are the continuity between administrations, between agency heads and cabinet officials, if you will. So that's how that works. 3 things happened this week that I think are worthy to think about talking about. First, I did have a 3.5-hour hearing last week before the House Budget Committee, where I talked about the fiscal condition of the union, which is bad and getting worse. I talked about what type of spending cuts do we need to be doing in 2024. I talked about what kind of mechanism do we need to put in place in order to put us in a position to make the tough choices on spending and revenues as it relates to getting debt to GDP down to a reasonable, sustainable level over the next 10 to 15 years. I talked about the need for a constitutional amendment that limits debt to GDP as the only realistic way that you can bind the current and future Congresses to force them to be able to toe the line on fiscal sanity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the trustees for Social Security and Medicare, I used to be one from 90 to 95, issued their annual report on Friday, which showed that the combined Social Security Trust Fund is 1 year closer to becoming insolvent, 2034, and that if they wait to let it become insolvent, they're going to have to cut benefits across the board 23%. Medicare is a little bit better shape because they redirected some revenues to Medicare. It goes to zero in 2031, and there would be an 11% across the board cut. And then the last thing I thought, which was of international significance, but also to the United States, is the deal that China and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia cut together to be able to do all transactions in yuan, and the fact that you now have a number of countries lining up to want to join the BRIC alliance, which, as you know, involves Russia, Brazil, Iran, and China. And as I said in my book, America in 2040 is still a superpower, ? There is an alliance against U.S. interests from an economic, from a diplomatic, from a military and a cultural perspective. And this is just another example to try to undercut the U.S. worldwide and to move towards alternatives to the dollar. And if there is a significant move away from the dollar within the next several years, if that occurs, then that's going to mean that our cost of borrowing is going to go up significantly. The advantages that we have in trade will be undercut somewhat, and our ability to impose economic sanctions will be dramatically undercut. And that's frankly one of the reasons that they're going to this, is because they don't like, the sanctions aspect and that being tied to the dollar, if you will. So those are just a few of the things that are going on. I'm happy to engage in a conversation or answer questions or whatever else, but it's a busy week.
Dave, it sounds like a busy week. I did watch some of the hearing. You definitely held your own and everything, so I was quite impressed. But then again, I've been impressed every time that I see you on here as well. But one thing I was curious about was actually alluded to earlier, and that is the notion that the debt has been growing consistently and all in that space. And I know that there were some panelists on before you came on that were talking about that this is I won't say a newer trend, but a growing trend and everything. And I think one of the things that was mentioned was the foreign debt, or the debt that we are to others. And it seems like there were some folks that were thinking that that was new. And I don't think that that's new, because I was actually even looking it up when we first were formed. We actually owed money to Britain, and I think also to the Dutch as well. So how much has that played a part in this growing debt that we've had, this amount of money that we've owed, not just to the Chinese, but to some of our fellow historical Western powers?
Well, it's not new, okay, but it's a matter of who do you owe to, and are their interests aligned with your interest or not? I mean, we had to borrow money from the Netherlands and France in order to be able to win the Revolutionary War. I mean, we borrowed money from other nations in the past in order to be able to accomplish very objective. Actually the biggest holder of our debt today is the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve has been self-dealing in our own debt, which I think either needs to be prohibited or severely limited, okay, because of the problems that it can otherwise cause.
David?
They're kind of, pardon me one second, they're kind of the lender of last resort. China and Japan own a lot of our debt. Other countries own a lot of our debt. But China's appetite has been curbed dramatically. They have curbed their appetite for U.S. debt, and it's part of their overall strategy. But keep in mind one thing. There's only one thing that's guaranteed by the Constitution, and this came up during the hearing, and that's U.S. debt and accrued interest. Nothing else is guaranteed. The other thing where there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation about is some people say, well, gee, if we bump up against the debt ceiling, we can't pay Social Security and Medicare. Wrong. As long as you have assets in the trust fund, which we do, you're just selling closely held debt, going to debt held by the public. It doesn't change the gross number at all. And so as long as you have, assets in the so-called trust funds, then you can still pay benefits on a timely basis. But you're going to have to cut back on something else, because nothing else is guaranteed by the Constitution, including Social Security and Medicare, quite frankly. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Or print money, David, right?
Well,
To follow up on that, Peter, yeah.
Well, but that's one of the reasons we got inflation, right? I mean, in theory, no, and in theory, they actually have to make hard choices. Okay, it's kind of like the trust funds, which I put in quotes. It's trust the government funds. They're not real trust funds. They don't have fiduciary liability and responsibility. Okay, they don't have conflict of interest rules or prohibited transaction rules, right? They're really just a sub-account of the general ledger. That's really all they are. On the other hand, the bonds do have economic significance, and the way that the debt ceiling works is you can't borrow internally or externally, right? And what's happened in the past is that when the Fed bought all that debt, it's because we spent more money underneath the debt ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
But rather than going to market, so we had to pay market rates, they bought it themselves to hold down interest rates. You know that, Peter. I mean, you're a lot more expert on financial markets than I am.
Well, that's why my number one prediction is that I talk about this in Wall Street Hackers almost every week. My prediction is that we're going to go through a serious phase of inflation now, because of energy, because of labor, because of terrible stimulus policies. But then it's going to dip the other way, because we'll get to a point where the debt is almost unsustainable to begin with, and they're going to drive interest rates down with yield curve control to almost zero. But it won't be a great situation for the American public, because let's say we have 5% inflation and rates are at zero. It's hard to earn any money anymore. The stock market will dip because of this first bang, from recession. Then it'll maybe come back up to where it was. But in the long run, the problem is then now you have inflation way over the actual amount people can earn. It's a very stagnant economy after that.
Stagflation.
Like Japan for the last 20 years, by the way.
Stagflation. Okay. I mean, the bottom line is bad news flows downhill, and the bottom of the hill is us.
Oh, yeah.
All right. The other thing you mentioned, Peter, which I appreciate you mentioning it, because it's another significant development within the last week. Okay. OPEC has announced that they're going to significantly, cut oil production over a million barrels a day.
1 million barrels a day.
Right. And it's the old thing, supply and demand, right? So, and we're getting ready to enter, starting Memorial Day, end up getting, the season where we've got a lot of people, driving, going on trips and things of that nature. So oil prices are going to go up. All right.
Without a doubt, we're heading into driving season. That was my number one point on the next show.
Yeah.
I think oil, I've been saying it forever, but, oil prices were down because of warm weather and because China partially closed. But I said, eventually China's going to open and we're going to have a normal driving season or a normal winter, and prices will be up at least in the 90s, if not double digits. A lot of people are talking about double digits again. As a matter of fact, today, because of that change in OPEC's policy, it looked like oil jumped about 5% today. And it's so ridiculously low considering in the long term, the underinvestment in the industry that's going to cause 5 years, 10 years of undersupply, because they're only in the oil and gas companies are only underinvesting by about 50% to what they used to do 5 years ago. And these are long-term projects. We're headed for trouble medium term.
Well, and Peter, as you know, I mean, the COVID situation ended up resulting in significantly less travel and use of fossil fuels, if you will, than otherwise would be the case. So, it's a tough situation. There's no question about it. But it's just another example of people teaming up against the U.S.
So, David, let me bounce in. I have one question for you. I have an idea. I don't know if you have to tell me, but I have an idea. It's a systematic way to reduce spending. And I think we need systematic ways to reduce it. I've never heard of anybody say it. It might be obviously complicated to administer, but there's my idea. I call it the challengeable presidential line veto. And this is how it would work. After the president uses the line veto, which is obviously a huge way to cut expenses, each party's in power, maybe a Republican one day, Democrat, they cut. But here's the difference. After the president uses the line item veto, Congress has the power to override, but only with a 2/3 vote by either of the two majority parties in the Senate and 2/3 vote by the House. So, in other words, in the Senate, either a Democrat or Republican, if they're the majority, gets a 2/3 vote, they can override it. Then you have to go to the other party. So either party still has some power over this. Did you follow what I said, David? It's a little complicated.
I'm not sure that I did, but let me tell you, I have for years been for a line item veto.
Of course.
Okay. But the president, but the Congress would still have the right to override any line item veto.
But let me just explain one more, because you see, this is first of all, the Supreme Court said no to the line item veto, but it could be done by constitutional issue. But
well, no, and that's the whole point. You have to do it through a constitutional amendment.
Yes.
There's no reason that couldn't be a component.
Right. But wait. But this is why let me throw this out, because this is why it's easier to sell. If you have just a line item veto, then one party is not going to be too happy. In other words, let's say your party, we'll use today. If you have a line item veto and you give it to President Biden, the Republicans, now we have a split house. It's different. Well, no, because
he's probably not going to be cutting much spending. So
no. Anyway, that's true. You're right. But the point is, this way, both parties would have the power to override any one line veto. In other words, when you go to the Senate, both parties, either of the parties, could have a 2/3 vote, and in the House, either of the parties would have a 2/3 vote. So now this gives Congress more of a balanced power to check the president, because let's say the Republicans were in the minority in both houses, but President Biden vetoed something. The Republicans could still override the veto because both majority parties in both houses could override with a 2/3 vote. Do you follow that?
What you're saying, the difference is, I understand what you're saying is rather than it being 2/3 of the entire body,
exactly,
it could be 2/3 of either party in either party.
Exactly. Now, so that's much more balanced and maybe more palatable to the party and minority, and it's a way that now that could go forward as a real check on the president, but gives him the line item veto.
Let me think about that, but you've properly pointed out that it would take a constitutional amendment. And again, I'm advocating for a single issue convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment, which is focused on limiting debt to GDP. But I've also said that as long as it relates to fiscal responsibility, you arguably could put it in there. And this is one thing that we ought to think about.
Hey,
line item veto has been talked about, but not in the way that you're talking about. That is,
Dave, why aren't bills passed line item? Why are bills packaged together with things that have nothing to do with each other?
Well, that's a different issue. There's supposed to be 12 or 13 appropriations bills, depending upon Senate or House, that get passed each year for like defense, for labor, for education, for interior, et cetera. The problem is that they have a very poor track record of doing their job on time. I was born in 1951. They've only passed all the appropriations bills by the beginning of the fiscal year, when they're supposed to take place, 4 times since 1951. And the last time they did it was 1996. So what they do is, since they don't end up addressing them one by one, they ended up bundling them all together and do what's called an omnibus. So
I understand. No one would shop like that.
No, and I'm adamantly against it, okay? And that's one of the things that I testified on, that we should never do an omnibus again, okay? Because what ends up happening is you don't have serious discussion and debate. You get a bunch of things to get thrown in there, and they typically wait until right before they need to break for the holidays. And so, people cave and just vote for something because they want to go home for the holidays.
But Dave, how many people actually pay attention to what they put in there? Because I know there's a lot of pork, as Lee is alluding to, that is thrown in there, and the bill might be about one thing, but they add in all kinds of other crazy things in there that they want. And
earmarks
on the right or the left, they just add them in there and all into that space. And it seems like that's been going on for decades, at least since the
Well-
time that I've been born.
Well, first, understand that Congress doesn't have a Truth in Advertising Act, okay? I mean, because you'd be shocked when what they do is they pick the name for a bill that is popular. All right, and knowing that most people will never read the bill because some of these bills are hundreds of pages long and they're in legalese, right?
Right.
So they'll go out there and say, "How can you be against the Inflation Reduction Act? I mean, what's wrong with you?" But then when you look and see what the hell it's all about, it's nearly not about inflation. Just one example, if you will. But look, I mean, the truth is, a lot of these bills are massive. The members don't read them. You know, they have.
Should there be a
their staff.
requirement that they do?
Well, there ought to be a number of requirements. Okay, I mean, the staff read it. Okay, the staff read it, and the ones that are really interested in certain things will read it. I told you what I said on the hearing. One of the things I said in the hearing was, I think that every member of Congress should be required to take an exam on the Constitution on Constitution Day and publish the results. Now, a supplement to that might be the exam that it takes that a naturalized citizen must pass in order to become a citizen. I think we would be shocked at what the results would be.
So, Kim, it's like my review process. That's what I just said earlier. We need a review process.
We need a review process, but I like the idea that they should have to take a test on our Constitution. And the reason is that even in employment, we are required to take classes and tests on many different things that, they say by law we have to adhere to. And it seems like the Congress and Senate, they all have just decided they're just fully immune from anything that they do wrong, and they just plow forward with things that they have no idea what the consequences are for everyone, or they really didn't read the bill. I mean, some of them you can't read the bill. I mean, look at the Obama Act. My God, that was 4,000 pages. And I don't think any bill should have more pages than the Constitution. If you can't describe what you need to get done quickly so that people can review it, make comments, then it doesn't need to go before anyone. I think that it needs to be limited and it needs to be sound and clear. And I agree with Lee in many ways that you don't need to add a bunch of stuff to each bill. Each bill should be titled one thing, and whatever it's titled, that should be what's in there, period.
Well,
nothing else.
Wait. I want to pitch my idea one more time, because the idea of a line item veto, the great thing about it, because as David says, people don't read the bill a lot. As Mark said, it's pork. As you just said, it's too big a bill. The thing about a line item veto is, president starts vetoing lines. Now the Congress has to look at it line by line to say, okay, we're going to override this or not. Plus, they still need 2/3. So let's say you have one congressman from one state who says, oh, I love this bill. It's lots of pork for me. But he still needs to get 2/3 of his party, whether it's the majority or the minority, on board. So now we're having a debate about line by line cutting, and yet Congress has power, and yet, the pork gets cut out a lot of times because maybe he can't get 2/3 of his own party to agree with the pork project. What do you think, David?
Well, yeah, you're talking about a line item veto for appropriations. Okay, I think it has merit. I absolutely think it has merit, and it's a creative way to think about it.
Well, it's a systematic change that would make a big difference.
Well, and that's
over time, because a president. Look, let's say you have a Democratic president now. Let's say a Republican president, a Democrat. They're line item vetoing different things. So now you have cutting by the Democrat. Now you have cutting by the Republican. You have cutting by the Democrat. So line by line, and now Congress is looking at each line. Each party is looking at it and saying, do we really need this? Do we really want it? Rather than just, here's a 500-page bill or 200-page bill. Well, I think it wouldn't solve all the problems, because we've gotten into a mess.
It would help. It would help.
It would help a lot.
You got to keep in mind a couple of things.
Yeah.
Earmarks have been around for a long time, but they were banned for a period of time. They were banned for a period of time in recent history, and they were brought back as part of this last omnibus bill. The debate about earmarks is, on one hand, you get things in there that have nothing to do necessarily with the topic. Sometimes they do have to do with the topic. For example, you got so much money for infrastructure and members want certain infrastructure projects to be done rather than being decided by career civil servants, right? I mean, that sometimes that's what it's all about. All right. But clearly there was way too much of it in the last. Sometimes they do it to get a vote. You know, I need your vote in order to pass this. I'll put this in so you can go home to your constituents and say you got this done. You can kind of hold your nose with regard to the rest of the bill, but at least you can tell people why you voted for it. Okay. And the other thing is that while I agree that bills ought to be what they're about and they ought to be of reasonable length and that people ought to have enough time to be able to read it, because they don't have enough time to read it now. Okay. They don't. You need to keep in mind, the shorter the bills are, the more power that's going to be given to the non-elected career civil servants to be able to write regulations, to be able to say, well, this is what we think they intended. And believe me, these people aren't neutral. Okay. I mean, these people are not neutral.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
true.
don't know that maybe they are even experts enough to maybe give those strong opinions that maybe it's more political as opposed to knowledge based. I agree. I mean, there's just so much going on. In what you reviewed, what are some of the things that is in proposal right now that could make us the most vulnerable in the very near future that we need to stay focused on? Because sometimes we're not informed and then it just hits us. And
Well, I think the thing that's going to be really significant this year is how are we going to resolve the debt ceiling? Okay.
right. Okay.
And in what I advocated for in my testimony was that what we ought to do is that we ought to have as a condition of raising the debt ceiling, the creation of a statutory fiscal sustainability commission
Agree.
that would be comprised of capable, credible, and non-conflicted individuals who would be charged with going to the American people and tilling the ground and building the case for needed reforms, okay? Listening to the American people as well as interest groups on what their thoughts are, what we should or shouldn't do, and then coming back and making a package of recommendations that would be guaranteed a vote in Congress. Basically learning the lessons for Simpson-Bowles, also having a more reasonable threshold for the level of support that the recommendations would have to be had among the commission members to get a guaranteed vote, something like 60%, which is all you need in the Senate, right? Rather than 75%, which is what it was for Simpson-Bowles, which meant a few people could scuttle the whole thing. You don't want that, okay? And so that's what I reckon. Other things that people are talking about, they're talking about, changing the welfare system to require work. Also increasing the age at which you must look at work from 49 to 65. I mean, clearly we need to make some welfare reform changes. I mean, Bill Clinton did that. Okay. I mean, and we've gotten away from it. We need to go back. We need to go back to that. My personal view is that's not the right condition. Okay. I mean, my view is that we need to create a mechanism that will help us to make the tough choices. And then the last thing I will say is, we have HCR, House Concurrent Resolution 24. Look it up.
I did.
That's the one that calls for a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment, unless they can prove that they haven't met the required number of states limits. We believe we have in 79 and 83. And so we had several meetings on the Hill last week, including with the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and some of his staff, because he has jurisdiction over these issues to try to move this forward. That needs to happen too. It'd be nice if they could, if they could do something in conjunction with that as part of the debt ceiling too. Again, we need to start treating the disease, and that's what Peter's talking about, right? We need systemic changes, that provide more meaningful checks and balances, and that force the Congress to make tough choices. Because if you don't do that, they're going to continue to do things that people like in the short term, but they're mortgaging our future over time.
But David, how do we make them? if we put some of these things in place in the accountability commission, which I think would be great. I don't know how long it would take us to do this, or who we've got available to kickstart it. It sounds like a lot of work, but how do you enforce it and then make them accountable? I mean, do you tell them you lose your job? I mean, what consequences follow accountability?
Well, first, from a conceptual standpoint, if you have a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment, they're going to decide what it is. Obviously, I'd like to be part of that since I've been fighting on this for a while and I know a fair amount about this. I mean, one possibility is that you have automatic targets and triggers. Things happen if they don't do what they're supposed to do. But another possibility is if they intentionally override it. In other words, they don't allow the automatic stabilizer mechanisms to come into place, even though they haven't made the tough choices. One possibility is they can't run for re-election. They lose their job because they take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and if they intentionally do something that is directly contrary to the Constitution, I would say they forfeit their right to run for re-election.
I agree. That's because you have to have consequences that go along with accountability. Otherwise, nothing ever gets done. So I agree with this. I do hope that they move forward with an administration like what you're speaking about. Because we need it. We need somebody to make them accountable. Because, I mean, at home, if we fail to do our economic duties, we lose.
Well,
right?
Here's the key.
We might lose our job.
Here's the key. If we do something wrong, we suffer the consequences. If they do something wrong, we suffer the consequences.
I mean, we suffer the consequences either way.
That dog don't hunt.
Yeah. Hey, Dave, just really quickly while I'm thinking about it, because there was and I know Steve said he was going to bring it up, but I'm going to bring it up since he's not here. There was a candidate that has said that he is thinking about running under a party that I know that you are a big supporter of and all in that nature. So I was just wondering your thoughts about Manchin saying that he is actually going to possibly run for president underneath the party that you have been backing and all of that. So I just wondered if this is going to be.
Who is it? Who is
Joe
it?
Manchin. Joe Manchin.
All right. Well, here's the deal. I'm heavily involved in this, and No Labels is dedicated to qualify in all 50 states for the ballot in the 2024 presidential election. Right. It is an insurance policy. It will only be triggered if the two major parties nominate candidates that are broadly unacceptable to the population, and if we can come up with two candidates, which we're confident we can, who we believe will win. So, in other words, this is not a spoiler effort, and there are very different conditions now than in the past, because for the first time, you have not only a significant majority of Americans believe we're headed in the wrong direction, you have 78% of Americans who believe that the future for our kids and grandkids will not be as good as ours. That's way over the historical number. Over 50% of Democrats don't want Biden. Over 50% of Republicans don't want Trump. Okay? And so what No Labels is doing is it's prepared to qualify and to run a unity ticket. Means they can't have the same party affiliation. All right? That pledged to support an issue-oriented, results-based agenda. There'll be a specific agenda. There's significant research been done on this to show that with the right candidates, meaning both the other two parties and whoever we come up with, that we can win 270 electoral votes or more. All right. And so that's the status. Okay. There are people that are interested in it. The decision on whether or not we're going to do it and who the ticket will not be until April of 2024. There's going to be a convention in Dallas in April of 2024, and I'll be there. And the decision will be made about whether we're going to do it and who we're going to do it with. And contrary to 2012, when Americans elect tried to do something similar. Very different situation. In 2012, you had a sitting president that was broadly acceptable to, enough to win. You had a Republican alternative, Mitt Romney, who was broadly acceptable enough to win. Okay. We didn't have the conditions that we have now. And you couldn't qualify for the presidential debates back then, but you can this time. They've changed the rules. You can this time. And that makes all the difference in the world, because you got to be able to go directly to the people with your case. Manchin is one of many people who would probably be interested in this. But that decision won't be made until down the road. And you have to have people who are willing to give up their party label, because, in 2012, you didn't have people who were willing to do that.
Well,
And one of the reasons they weren't willing to do it is because you had acceptable candidates, right?
he specifically mentioned
Well,
the no
there's-
label. He specifically mentioned the no label party when he made that announcement. I think he made it yesterday and everything. And definitely, I do know that there have been some interesting efforts at independent runs, because I was somewhat of a supporter of Mr. Anderson when he ran way back when. John Anderson, and a lot of people don't remember, because it was a long shot campaign, if there was ever a long shot campaign. But Lenora Falani also ran independently as well. And I think
Ralph Nader ran.
I want to
This is
Right. I
not
want to ask a question about this, though. Will this eliminate the need for primaries? And if not, can we reduce the primaries to a one-day election so we don't end up with the laggers by the time they get to North Carolina? Because I get tired of being told this is who's
Tim, we don't have a general election, a one-day election.
I want a one-day election.
All right, first, for no labels, we won't have a primary. There'll be no primary.
Okay, so that's fine.
There will be people who express interest, and there will be a decision-making body of no labels, which I don't know if I'll be part of that or not. There's a good chance I will be, but there'll be a decision-making body of no labels that will make the decision on who the candidates are, on whether to run and who the candidates are.
Okay, I like that. I'm good with that.
The parties have control over the primary process at the state level.
Yeah.
That's a state level issue. In theory, under the Constitution, the Congress has the right to set rules for federal elections. So in theory, they could set rules for federal elections. Okay. They generally haven't. They've let the states run with it. Okay. And the parties, if you saw, the parties aren't letting Iowa caucuses go first. They're not letting New Hampshire primary go first. This is for the Democrats. I mean, they're letting South Carolina go first because that's more favorable to the sitting president, right?
Right.
The Republicans so far aren't changing the order. They're sticking with the order that's existed for a number of years.
Well, I would like to see a more balanced primary alternative, but I like your no labels outlay.
Check it out at nolabels.org.
Everyone, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you very much for joining us. And if
pleasure.
you have any questions, please submit them. We are a live show so that you can also, pop in and ask us questions live. But, David, thank you for all your work that you're doing there on Capitol Hill. And we will take more effort to help support the HCR 24. Everyone, have a beautiful day. Take care.
Hey, Tim, I want to become Lee's. I want to do Lee's campaign event when he becomes president. So I'm going to do the campaign party. Will that work for you?
I got you down,
Sounds
Mark.
good.
Sounds
We'll do
good.
a party. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.